Good day, economic students. The purpose of these videos is to introduce the topics of money and banking, chapters 14 and 15 from the McConnell Brew macroeconomics textbook. We start off by asking a question which seems like it should be easy to answer. What is money? Money bewitches people. They fret for it, they sweat for it, they devise the most ingenious ways to get it, and the most ingenious ways to get rid of it. Money is the only commodity that is good for nothing but to be gotten rid of. It will not feed you, clothe you, shelter you, or amuse you unless you spend it or invest it. It imparts value only in parting. People will do almost anything for money, and money will do almost anything for people. Money is a captivating, circulating, masquerading puzzle. Now, I wish I was intelligent enough to come up with that on my own, but that's from the Federal Reserve of Philadelphia paper on creeping inflation going all the way back to 1957. Therefore, can we write a definition for money? Well, money is what money does. That might sound like the worst definition of all times, but it actually functions pretty well, and that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. As long as something can perform the three functions of money, that something is money. So, what are the three functions of money? The three functions of money include, number one, medium of exchange. Money must serve this function. Prior to having any physical object or any paper circulating backed by a physical object, human beings had to depend on barter for economic exchange. There is a huge inconvenience with barter. The two parties must have a coincidence of wants. In other words, I must have something to trade that you want, and you must have something that I want in order for that trade to take place or to facilitate that economic activity. You can understand how challenging this was on a small scale when people brought their goods to market, but on a much larger scale, it simply would not work. The macroeconomy would simply not have enough people with enough coincidence of wants. Therefore, we need money to facilitate this idea of convenient exchange of goods and services. The last piece of this medium of exchange is extremely important. The idea that because money functions as a medium of exchange, it allows for geographic and human specialization. So, for instance, we do not grow citrus fruits in Idaho, and we do not grow potatoes in Florida. It allows for human beings to invest capital and labor and land into producing products in areas where it makes the most sense based on comparative advantage and productive efficiency. It also permits people to concentrate their individual talents into producing a product in which they have some type of natural gift. So, for instance, if a woman is a chemist, she might dedicate her entire professional career, her occupation of into chemistry. She serves society best by concentrating her specialty and allowing money to facilitate the exchange of goods when she needs to go to the grocery store or pay for her doctor's visit or get her car detailed. So this idea that human beings can specialize in producing the product in which they have some type of talent. A unit of account. Unit of account. Think of 5 goods and 5 services that are worth roughly $100. So if I asked you, make a list of 5 goods and 5 services that are worth roughly $100. I mean, right off the top of your head, you could say, okay, a decent pair of running shoes, a really decent watch, a really nice shirt could be $100. Maybe if for the ladies, a purse. For a guy, maybe something like a decent pair of dress shoes, right? A tire for your car might be $100. When you go to services, things like 1 month's worth of cell phone service, getting your car detailed, 1 trip to the dentist office to get your teeth cleaned, right? We could easily make a list of goods and services that are worth roughly $100. Money allows for us to price compare, facilitates price comparison. Money is the yardstick that allows us to add up the value of a good or a service. This is extremely important because it harkens back to our idea of opportunity cost. In other words, I can either get tickets to the concert, which are worth roughly $100, or I can decide to replace the upholstery in the back of my car, which is $100, right? So we understand that money defines value if it functions as a unit of account. On a bigger scale, macroeconomic measurement, we already talked about this in a previous chapter on national income accounting, but allows the Bureau of Economic Analysis to add up the value of economic activity for the entire country. So medium of exchange, unit of account, finally store of value. Typically, people do not spend their entire paycheck on the day they receive it. So money needs to transfer purchasing power from one period to the next. So for instance, if you revisit that list of 5 goods and 5 services worth roughly $100 today, you would assume that in a year they are roughly still worth $100 because money in your pocket doesn't lose value quickly. If it did lose value quickly, it would not serve this function. So you're pretty certain that the $100 in your pocket, in your wallet, in your bank account will be able to purchase the same goods and services this time next year. We understand there might be some slight inflation. Now, what is liquidity? The degree to which an asset can be exchanged for goods and services. In other words, can you take something you own and exchange it for something else? By definition, money is the most liquid of all assets. Money is easily transferable to other goods and services. We use the McConnell book, and it refers to the dollar being the global greenback. In other words, people will accept money all around the world for goods and services. Now, what about some other assets that are relatively liquid but not quite as liquid as money? Gold is actually pretty liquid. It's a rather liquid asset because you can figure out the value of gold just by exchanging it for money based on today's troy ounce value of an ounce of gold, and that's easily available on the New York and London Stock Exchange. So you know exactly how much something in weight is in gold is worth because there's a barometer to facilitate price comparison. How about something like stocks? If you own 100 shares of, say, Netflix, again, because it trades so frequently on exchanges, it's easy to convert Netflix stocks into cash if you have a brokerage account. Something like a house might be something that's a little bit less liquid. Depending on the current state of the real estate market, it could take 6 days, 6 weeks, 6 months to sell your house. Now, of course, there are times when the real estate market is booming and people sell houses extremely quickly. Over time, there have been 3 types of money. The first one's the easiest to explain. The physical object itself is the money. Gold coins, shark's teeth. Back in the day when trappers were just navigating the North American landscape, they would use furs as money. As long as everyone agrees that the commodity itself is the money and it functions as those 3 previous characteristics, the commodity can be the money. We went from commodity money to a little more convenient, less cumbersome, where we had commodity-backed money. In other words, every dollar in circulation represented a certain amount of a physical commodity, typically gold. The United States left the gold standard in the early 70s, and Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard. All countries around the globe today, all modern industrialized nations, work on what's called a fiat currency. Now, this sounds a little crazy, but there's nothing intrinsic backing the value of the dollar, the yen, the euro, the British pound. Only the government's ability to keep the value of its currency relatively stable, and we'll talk more about that in a few moments. Now, when we define money, the most narrow definition of money to explain the money supply is referred to as M1. So we're trying to explain here the money supply. What is the money supply? M1 is the most narrow definition of money, and it includes currency and coins, checkable deposits. So currency includes Federal Reserve notes, aka cash. If you were doing a crossword puzzle and it was a 4-letter word for Federal Reserve notes, the answer would be cash, right? And token money, meaning coins. The quarter in your pocket the metal itself is worth less than 25 cents. Otherwise, people would melt them down and exchange the metal for more than 25 cents. So coins and cash are part of M1, as M as in Mary, M as in money, and then all money in checking accounts. Now, the McConnell book goes into the difference between commercial banks and thrift institutions. We're just going to call them all checking accounts. We'll call them all banks for simplicity. So any money that people have deposited into a checking account are considered part of M1. Now, think about it. Most transactions take place through checking accounts, either writing a check or electronic transfer of funds through checking accounts. M1, let's expand. M2 is the definition of money, or the way to understand the money supply that is watched by our nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve. Right? So M2 includes all of M1, so coins, cash, checkable deposits, everything we just discovered on the previous slide, plus what we call some near monies. These include money in savings accounts and money market accounts and smaller time deposits of $250,000 or less. These are easily convertible into either cash or checking accounts, and in many ways, money markets are glorified checking accounts. This graph shows you, or chart I should say, in 2008 that there was $1.365 trillion worth of M1 and $7.5 trillion worth of M2 in circulation. It also shows that only 18% of M2 is made up by coins, cash, and checkable deposits, and that the vast majority of M2 are those nearer monies that we talked about, smaller time deposits and money in money market accounts and money in savings accounts. Remember, the Federal Reserve controls M2 and most closely watches M2. This is the same idea using a pie chart. And again, coins, cash, which is currency, plus checkable deposits, at this point made up about 24% of M2. Now, here's an interesting chart. It's not in the book. I looked this up somewhere else. So it shows you the growth in the money supply from 1980 through 2010. As you can see by this chart, currency has not grown much as far as money supply growth from 1980 through 2010. Right, that lime green bottom line there. M1 itself has not grown enormously from 1980 through 2010. But you see a significant growth in M2, the nation's money supply, especially after 2007. One reason for this is because our nation's central bank expanded the money supply in response to the financial downturn and the real estate collapse that happened in 2007 and the recession which followed in 2008, 2009, and full recovery probably didn't start until well into 2010. We'll talk more about the Federal Reserve's quantitative easing and its bond buying program later on in these videos, but just a brief explanation. That's why the nation's money supply grew so quickly from that period, 2007 on. What about your good old credit card? Credit cards, you say, well, I can spend money on my credit card anywhere, but technically your credit card is simply a loan between you and your bank. It is not money. What backs the nation's money supply? All money is debt. This is a crazy idea to think about, but Federal Reserve notes, aka cash, is simply debt issued by our nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve. So if you were to take a $20 bill down to the Federal Reserve branch at 7th and Arch in Philly, they would say, would you like 21s, 4 5s, 2 10s, some mix of 5s, 10s, and 1s. But money's only going to be redeemed with other money. It's just debt issued by our nation's central bank. Likewise, money in checking accounts is debt that banks owe to their customers. Therefore, what gives money value? There are 3 characteristics that give money value. First is that money is accepted readily for exchange of goods and services. You can take cash almost anywhere, and of course, people will take it. All right, we referred to this idea earlier of the global greenback, the idea that dollars are accepted in almost any country around the world, that people like U.S. dollars because they know that other people will take them when they want to purchase other goods and services. Unfortunately, this leads to some illicit activities taking place in dollars because drug dealers like dollars because they know that U.S. currency is going to hold its value. The second characteristic that gives money value is this idea of legal tender. On cash, it says, good for all debts, public and private. It has the government's stamp of approval. So the fact that the government says it's money. But the third idea here is probably most important, relative scarcity, that the supply of money is relatively scarce in comparison to the demand for money. The idea that supply and demand factors, just like any other commodity we've ever investigated, impact the value of a currency. It's the nation's central bank, our Federal Reserve. It's their job to grow the money supply quickly enough or rapid enough to facilitate economic growth for the country, but to make sure that the money supply doesn't grow too quickly, which would cause inflation. We'll talk about that in a moment here. So, money and prices. The value of a dollar, right? The value of a dollar can be stated as D equals 1 over the price level, or the value of a dollar is inversely related to the price level. Think of it in these terms. If you had $100 in your pocket in the start of the year and inflation was 2%, at the end of that year, the purchasing power of your $100 declined by roughly 2%. Now, of course, not all goods and services move in the same direction when you talk about changes in price level, but you understand the idea that inflation erodes the purchasing power of money. Now, this can become a serious problem. Inflation and acceptability. Post-World War I Germany, France and Britain wanted to make Germany pay for the war that they had started and the damage they had caused Europeans, loss of life and loss of property, and of course it was a horrific time. But Woodrow Wilson warned Britain and France about making Germany pay war reparations, was one of the factors which led to the decline or the destruction of what's called the value of the German mark. Germany printed so many marks, that was the German currency before they started to use the euro, that the value of the German mark in an 18-month period became worth 1/1 billionth of its previous value. So think of it in these terms. If this time next year it cost you $100 to buy a candy bar, which used to cost $1, the value of the dollar is worth 1/100th of its previous value. So the German mark was worth 1/1 billionth of its previous value. People were literally taking German marks and putting them into their stoves to light fires. Right? So hyperinflation, that's called, when the currency ceases to serve as a medium of exchange, a store of value, and a unit of account.